Selamat sore Sobat Mitra Wacana semuanya. Kita ketemu lagi dalam acara Sinau Sareng Mitra Wacana yang ke-11. Ini agak berbeda karena saya juga pertama kali jadi host ini. Lalu ada narasumber yang spesial juga, ada 2 orang. Nanti saya kenalkan. Ada Mbak Sandra, ada Mbak Lauren. Ada Mbak Lauren. Ya, jadi seperti poster yang sebelumnya uh, Mitra Wacana setelah publish, kita akan diskusi. Ada 2 hal sebenarnya yang akan didiskusikan dengan 2 narasumber ini. Kebetulan mereka saat ini magang di Mitra Wacana, program internship. Keduanya berasal dari Australia. Lalu nanti kita sedikit berbeda dari yang lain karena akan banyak dengan bahasa Inggris, mungkin sedikit campuran bahasa Indonesia, bahasa Melayu, dan sedikit bahasa Jawa. Itu sinau sareng bahasa Jawa ya. Nah, kita akan mulai karena waktunya juga pendek, jadi kurang lebih 1 jam, misalnya molor-molor ya dikit gitu. Jadi kita punya 2 bahasan. Itu yang pertama itu berkaitan dengan domestic violence in Australia and Malaysia. Ini nanti Mbak Sandra. Lalu yang kedua itu temanya women participation in workplace in Australia. Ini Mbak Lawrence. Mbak Lauren. Kita nanti sedikit pakai bahasa Inggris. Bahasa Inggris saya juga agak kacau, nanti mungkin grammarnya mungkin nggak tepat, nggak
I
apa-apa.
help you translate.
Dia akan bantu translate. Oke, kita akan mulai. Mbak Sandra dulu, ya. Oke. Oke, ini menarik karena sebenarnya kita akan bicara kasus domestic violence itu tidak hanya yang kita diskusikan di Indonesia, tapi ternyata ada beberapa hal yang menarik yang kita bisa lihat di negara lain, misalkan Australia atau mungkin Malaysia. Jadi Mbak Sandra ini pernah tinggal di Malaysia dan juga Australia. Oke, lanjut. Kita tanyakan langsung kepada narasumbernya. Saya tanyanya walaupun dia bisa bahasa Melayu, saya men pakai bahasa Inggris. Saya baca. Jadi the first question is about domestic violence. Are domestic violence case also common in Australia and Malaysia? Is there any case data in there? Ini.
Yes. Actually,
Ya.
in Australia, there it is called an invisible silent epidemic that's occurring in our country, and in Malaysia as well. Even though reported cases are only around 39%, it's actually something that's happening quite rampantly in the country. It's just that there is a cultural adherence where people don't like to talk about problems that occur in private spaces.
Okay.
So if you look at the data, Australia and Malaysia, there is a similarity. The highest bracket of the ages of women where domestic violence occurs is between the ages of 25 and 45. So it's the childbearing ages of the women. In Australia, on average, 1 woman a week dies from domestic violence. Yeah. Either by a current partner or a former partner. 1 woman a week is killed in Australia. Yeah. And I was looking at just some statistics earlier this afternoon, and I'll just read it out because it's pretty interesting. It says that 1 in 4 women in Australia would have experienced physical or sexual violence by a partner before the age of 15, and that is the same as well in Malaysia.
Okay.
Before the age of 15, yeah. And women are 5 times more likely than men to require medical attention or be admitted into a hospital as a result of victim violence. So these statistics are quite intense, yeah. In Malaysia, though, like there's a difference because of the statistics of domestic violence actually vary quite vastly in Malaysia. So the highest incidence of domestic violence is actually in the state Kedah, which subscribes to more conservative Muslim views. In Kedah, female performers like musicians, like singers, they're female, they can only perform to a female audience. So it's quite conservative over there, and they rank as the highest percentage of domestic violence in Malaysia. Yeah, and apparently in Malaysia, there has been a 66% increase in domestic violence since 2012. So it's just spiked really suddenly, but I mean, I guess you could argue whether the statistics is just because people are more willing to talk about it now and that or report the incidents of domestic violence, but previously maybe it was just as bad, but people wouldn't talk about it. Maybe it could be a shift in the women, but at the minute it's just gone up and it's pretty high. So, and they're saying that about 9 out of 10 cases of rape or violence goes unreported in Malaysia. Yeah. Yeah.
And in Australia, any domestic violence is a big problem. Is there any like civil movement to prevent
Actually,
domestic violence? Oh yeah. Okay, I'm forget to use it. I will ask again. But is there any apa like civil movement in Malaysia to prevent the domestic violence? For example, in Indonesia, some NGOs apa campaign on social aid to apa prevent the apa domestic violence. And there are many too in
like NGOs.
yeah.
Mm, in Australia, there has been a lot of laws that have been passed. And actually, recently, it's just been made, I think they've just trial run like a couple of years ago, respectful relationship programs in schools. I myself was working with an organization called the Domestic Violence Resource Center, where in that agency they ran trainings for domestic violence frameworks, safety frameworks. It also involved training to organizations on technological stalking, and for youth, and as well on how to determine whether how to keep a person safe if they were experiencing domestic violence. So there is quite a bit going on, and from the legal side of things, it's different in each state. In Australia, it's slightly different. So each state kind of has their own slight variance on the legislation of domestic violence. So, for instance, actually, I was just talking to Lauren about it earlier. How in Queensland, they when they look at domestic violence, it includes as well violence that occurs within the relationship of a one night stand. So, if a woman has a child out of wedlock with someone that she's only been with for one night, it still goes under the domestic violence protection laws in Queensland.
Okay. It
Yeah.
means domestic violence is so maybe a big problem in
It is a really big
both
problem in
countries,
Australia. Yeah,
Malaysia and Australia.
yeah, in Malaysia and Australia, but I think Australia at the minute they're more willing to talk about it. You
Oh,
know, so we've had a lot of our government actually is putting a lot of attention and money into the area at the minute, just because our women entering hospital, being injured, being out of the workforce, being homeless. Actually, a lot of cases of homelessness in Australia amongst women relates back to domestic violence. So it's a big strain, a burden on our economy. So the government is actually trying to build it back up from from the base level up. So there's a lot of money being pumped into it at the minute. In Malaysian, I think that there is a big, strong women's action group that is going on at the minute, but it's difficult. They do work against a lot of hurdles because even though, for instance, they came up with there was the Domestic Violence Act in, let me check, let me just double check the year. Yeah, it was in 1994 that they came up with the Domestic Violence Act. But there's just always these hurdles in Malaysia that they have to go through because, for instance, that act, they're refusing to use it for civil issues in Malaysia because they're saying that civil issues, particularly amongst the Muslim community, should be handled by the Sharia laws. So there's this discrepancy, right? It cannot be applied to a certain population, and then it's only tied to the criminal, what's that word for it? Legislation for certain things.
Okay.
Yeah, because of the issue of the cultural adherence to the religion and that little nuance of that. Yeah, so it's just a bit of a problem in Malaysia.
I think domestic violence sometimes very difficult to solve sometimes because related with the cultural
Yeah.
in the some place like that. But in Malaysia or in Australia, any specific regulation that like in Indonesia we have a specific regulation about domestic violence because maybe in the past many case happened in here, but I don't know.
Is this the law number 23,
Oh, yeah.
2004 that in
Oh
Indonesia?
yeah, huh?
Yeah.
And I don't know in Australia and Malaysia any specific,
Yeah. So
regulation?
in
And it is if any specific regulation, it is the strong way to prevent the domestic violence or any cultural way to prevent the
Yeah, well,
domestic
I think in Indonesia, the one that you're referring to would be law number 23, 2004.
violence.
In Malaysia, the Domestic Violence Act, it would be the Domestic Violence Act 1994 that they came up with. Because before that, domestic violence, quite similar to Indonesia, was not considered, they wouldn't want to put it under the criminal law. Because in Malaysia, I think culturally a little bit similar, right,
Oh,
to
yeah.
Indonesia. Like, no one wants to talk about an issue that happens in the private sphere. Like, no one wants to create any problems in the household, right? So they had to actually make this Domestic Violence Act 1994 to make a strong stance against domestic violence.
Oh.
But the implementation, again, it becomes a problem in Malaysia
Oh.
because people are afraid to report. Even though there is a law now that helps,
Yeah.
but people are afraid to report because in Malaysia we have this thing jatuh muka, yeah, you know.
Jatuh
We don't want,
muka.
yeah.
Bahasanya jatuh
Jatuh
muka.
muka, yeah, because it brings shame onto the family if you're having problems with your husband. Yeah. And also, like, I think the cultural thing in Malaysia is that, like, a woman's role is defined by her relationships in society. So a woman is not a woman unless she's a wife, unless she's a mother. So it's really important, that role. And if you're not doing well in the home, then jatuh muka. So people don't really report it. And also, well, like, in the courts, in the police system, in the justice system, there's no gender sensitivity to it. So if you come in and you say, like, oh, I'm having problems at home, they were like, oh, go home and take care of your husband.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
They don't see it as a big deal. So even though this law has come up, the problem implementation still becomes a problem.
And it is different with Australia.
In Australia, in Australia, domestic violence is defined by the Family Law Act 1975. I look at her because she's studying law.
Okay.
And yeah, as I was saying before, like, Australia is interesting as well because each state has a different definition of domestic violence. It's just a very slight difference. So, for instance, I live in Melbourne. In Melbourne, domestic violence is referred to as family violence. So the definition includes as well children who witness violence within the house. So if, say, the wife or the partner is being shouted or beaten in front of the child, the perpetrator can still be charged under that act.
Oh.
Yeah. And I think it differs even in South Australia, and in New South Wales it's slightly different.
Okay. Add something?
No.
Okay, I ever ask you about the contribution of society. Maybe more apa? Specific you apa? Share about your activity NGOs that you apa, share apa? Related in preventing of domestic violence or violence in Australia. Maybe you can share about the activity, specific activity your NGOs in Australia.
Mm. So at the minute, what I feel quite passionately about and the work that's being done in Australia, because we have such a large immigrant population in Australia, there has been a lot of grassroots movements, for women who come from diaspora communities. So where they get these women together to form little groups where they can hang out and cook and talk because they're not in their communities. So and a lot of the support services that we have in Australia, not really suitable. It's not really geared to support women who are foreigners because of the language and the cultural context. Our support system usually, if they try to access health and mental care, unfortunately, is run by mostly white Australian who might not understand the cultural context that they are going through. So they have that sort of like more community based sorts of initiatives. I know as well, like the program that I was a part of, the men's behavioral change program. So they've got groups for perpetrators where the men can come in. That one is a court mandated program, but I believe that there are others as well where there are groups for the men to come together and just to talk. Mm, yeah, there's quite a bit of going on actually. Yeah.
Okay, and every apa some place in Australia, for example Melbourne, Sydney, and different place have some like NGO like that.
Oh yeah, we have a lot. Like we have heaps of NGOs. Like
Ah,
yeah, especially like pertaining to women's rights
ah,
and domestic violence and all over Australia.
oh, okay,
Yeah, but I mean, I live in Sydney. I live in Melbourne, so I wouldn't know much about other
okay.
states. But she's from Perth, so maybe you can weigh in on that.
Um, we have a really large problem in Australia with really high domestic violence rates in regional communities,
Ah,
rural communities,
mm,
and obviously as a product of being regional and rural, they have less services there, they have less NGOs and less women's groups. So there is a bit of a problem with that, but we do have I know of, for example, like one example of a movement that has sprung up, and it is to do with domestic violence in Aboriginal communities. So it's a culturally specific program or NGO, and they specifically work with Aboriginal men about reframing the way that they think about violence in their community. Which is so there are programs that are beginning to sort of emerge in that space, but at the moment, regional and rural Australia is really sort of being left behind in terms of servicing with those sorts of organisations.
I might add to that as well, like that because the incidence of domestic violence is actually the highest amongst the indigenous population in Australia, that there are a lot of initiatives within the city, like say Melbourne City, for instance, for indigenous women to come together.
mm,
So it might not specifically be directed at domestic violence, but because there is a difficulty in finding support because they're so displaced from their own communities. So initiatives like gardening, where they come together and they build their own sustainable garden, they come together and eat and talk and have a group.
mm.
It gives them that support because they're not anywhere near the places of where they originate from. In the city, they're displaced. So I think that really helps and it's important as well. Yeah.
Okay, interesting to discussion about that. Oke, saya kira menarik nanti teman-teman bisa ikut terlibat diskusi, bisa tanya jawab di sini lewat WA. Katanya lewatnya WA di bawah ini. Nggak tahu udah dipasang belum. Yang jelas teman-teman nanti bisa terlibat bertanya pakai bahasa Indonesia nggak apa-apa. Nanti dia yang nerjemahin. Oke, nanti setelah tanya jawab kita akan di sesi kedua itu ada Lawrence. Tapi after break. Oke, mungkin tambahan sambil menunggu apa ada pertanyaan. Oh ya, ada pertanyaan. Sebentar saya baca dulu. What about community participant in women action group for the prevention of domestic violence? From netizen. Apa itu maksudnya? What about community participation in women action group for the prevention of domestic violence?
So the question is about community roles in prevention of domestic violence. So we've had a large sort of campaign, particularly from the government, about domestic violence. So that's about getting the public to, I guess it's like socialization. It's about getting the public to really consider domestic violence and to consider so that you're aware of it, so that if someone was to tell you about it, then you would be aware of it. But another major one that's happened recently is, I believe, in Victoria. They've done a campaign that is on little ways that men in particular can speak up about domestic violence. So, or speak up about, it doesn't necessarily have to be violence, but like uncomfortable situations that women are in with other men. So there are some examples, for example, an ad where a woman is being stared at on the bus by a man who's making her uncomfortable, and another man seeing that happen and him just stepping in the way so that they're not able to see each other anymore. And it's about us sort of trying to engage the community in saying you don't have to be a passive bystander. You can actively help someone without being aggressive or without putting yourself at risk as well. So we do have campaigns about those sorts of things, but I'm not sure about
I
community
think
groups.
even I can't remember the name of it, but I think that there's actually like a Facebook viral campaign that's going on that started in Melbourne of your girlfriend is not your something, where it's just saying that your I think I can't remember the exact specifics of what it actually says, but it kind of means that your partner is not your emotional scapegoat, or your partner is not there to fix you. Your partner is not there to make you happy, because it's kind of addressing the fact that like there is this culture of expecting a woman to shoulder the burden of a relationship. So that, and as well, recently there was an ad campaign for boxer shorts. Yeah, there was. Also kind of like alluding to sort of like the incidents of domestic violence and how real men don't, use violence against women. So there is a bit going on. And I think that one of the things that like that goes on that maybe isn't spoken about that much is that within the youth nowadays, there's a lot of like I've noticed anyway, there's a lot of kids, there's a lot of art that goes on in Melbourne that speaks about domestic violence. There's a lot of dialogue going on about it within the young people.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question before we get a break. About about domestic helper, domestic helper, because maybe it is different condition in Malaysia or in Australia, maybe in Indonesia too. You can maybe share about domestic help, because we something read in the news that the victim is a domestic helper, like that. It is more majority. What's your opinion?
Yeah. So to be to be honest, Australia doesn't really have a culture of having domestic helpers. But they do have them. I think, but it's kind of like something that's kept invisible because of the stigma of having a domestic helper in Australia. And so I actually read, I've read a couple of articles about how it's almost a little bit of an incidence of human trafficking that's going on in Australia, where these domestic helpers, they're not registered. And because of the stigma of domestic helpers in Australia, people don't talk about them, and they are being abused. So actually, there is a whole thing that's going on under the surface in Australia. In Malaysia, domestic helpers and abuse, it is accounted for in the Domestic Violence Act. Yeah, because but I think as well there are certain concessions. I'm not really sure about the specifics, but the law does include people living in the house who experience domestic violence, because a lot of people in Malaysia have a lot of families in Malaysia do have domestic helpers that live in with the family, and they do experience violence. Yeah.
Oh no. Yeah, in Australia we don't have domestic helpers. So, like Sandra said, there are incidences of that occurring, but it's a really small, and it's still a big problem, and we do need to address it. But it's a very, very small percentage of Australian households that have that, because we can't afford to pay domestic helpers. That would be because we have incredibly strong employment. Yeah, so that's why it becomes a problem with human trafficking. But even then, it's a really small, like the percentage of houses, I've previously looked at numbers, but I can't quote any, like the percentage of houses that have domestic workers or that are thought to have domestic workers is just incredibly low, because we don't have a culture of having that. And actually, as Sandra sort of alluded to, it's almost in the reverse. We have a really negative culture towards having domestic helpers. It's like really sort of looked down on. So it's not something that is necessarily like a problem in Australia. There are problems with it, but it's a bit separate from how you would think about it in other countries, I think.
Okay, I will try to translate. Oke, apakah ada pertanyaan menarik ini? Apakah di Australia dan Malaysia ditemukan konsep laki-laki yang ngurus rumah tangga, houseman? Ya, he asked about are any in Australia or in Malaysia the concept about the man as like houseman.
Like a stay-at-home father, a stay-at-home.
Then the woman work.
Yeah. Well, I think that in Malaysia, it's probably still follows a more traditional gender role. You know? But of course, I think that it really, like, as in Malaysia and Australia, I haven't lived in Malaysia for a long time, so I can't really talk too much. But I think that the climate surrounding this is changing. But it really as well depends on the socio-economic and education kind of strata of society, isn't it? That where this change is occurring. I think that in more, I guess, like modern families, then perhaps it would be more it does happen where like the gender roles are not as defined and follow tradition. A lot of women in Australia now, I mean, Lauren's going to be talking about it, work full-time jobs and have children, and their partners go out and work and earn less than them, and it's generally not a problem. In Malaysia, I think because a lot of the families tend to live with their parents. Yeah, so because it's an Asian culture, right? So they don't move out. They live with their family. So if the wife is working, the husband works too. And then the mother-in-law or the mother takes care of the children. So I can't really weigh in on whether men are working in the house in Malaysia. But I think in Australia, like definitely stereotypes are changing. But Lauren has a bit to say on it.
Okay.
I can do that.
Okay, she's going to be talking about that, I think.
Okay. It means we will break.
Thanks.
Okay, after that we will discuss the Lauren topics. Oke, kita break dahulu.
Mitra Wacana merupakan sebuah organisasi yang terletak di Jalan Pelemulung nomor 42, Gedongan Baru, RT 6, RW 43, Banguntapan Bantul, Daerah Istimewa Yogyakarta. Didirikan pada tanggal 2 April tahun 1996, Mitra Wacana berdinamika dalam persoalan perempuan dan anak.
Mitra Wacana mempunyai visi terwujudnya masyarakat berkeadilan gender di Indonesia. Mitra Wacana mempunyai misi 2. Yang pertama, membangun masyarakat demokratis, pluralis, dan berkesetaraan. Kemudian yang kedua, membangun organisasi yang kredibel dan dipercaya oleh para pemangku kepentingan.
Mitra Wacana mempunyai 2 program, menangani kesehatan reproduksi yang terletak di bagian kota Yogyakarta, serta pencegahan perdagangan manusia yang terletak di daerah Kulon Progo.
Salah satu program Mitra Wacana untuk kesehatan reproduksi adalah promosi kesehatan masyarakat untuk perencanaan kehamilan dan penanganan kehamilan yang tidak dikehendaki. Tujuannya adalah untuk meningkatkan akses pelayanan dan informasi yang komprehensif tentang hak kesehatan seksual dan reproduksi, khususnya tentang perencanaan kehamilan dan penanganan kehamilan yang tidak dikehendaki.
Mitra Wacana menjalankan program pencegahan perdagangan orang di Kabupaten Kulon Progo, khususnya di 9 desa di wilayah Sentolo, Ngalur, dan Mokam. Kami berbasis pada kelompok perempuan yang kita sebut Pusat Pembelajaran Perempuan dan Anak. Kemudian kami menciptakan sebuah masyarakat yang sadar dan mempunyai peran aktif.
Mitra Wacana merupakan
Oke, kita ketemu lagi di sesi yang kedua. Kita akan ngobrol bersama Lauren, nanti Sandra bisa nambahi. Oke, tema yang kedua ini juga menarik, sebenarnya masih berkaitan dengan isu perempuan tadi, domestic violence. Sekarang women participation in workplace in Australia. Nah, ini menarik karena mungkin isu ini, problem ini menjadi diskusi menarik di Indonesia. Nah, kita mungkin bisa mencari tahu kalau di Malaysia seperti apa, seperti itu. Oke, Lauren. Okay, and we will discuss about the topic women participation in workplace in Australia. Okay, I will read the first question to you about: are there still any gender problem related with women participation in the workplace? Yeah.
Yep. So in relation to women's participation in the workplace in Australia, we still have some issues.
Maybe
absolutely.
more need. Yeah.
Sorry. We still have some issues. Having said that, 47% of all employed people are women. So we're heading towards basically have a 50-50 split of employment between with men and women. Having said that, 37% of full-time employees are women and 68% of part-time employees are women. So what that's telling us is that the vast majority of people who are working part-time are women. And if we sort of delve into that a little bit further, if we start to look at anything up to the middle management sector of the workforce, women are quite evenly represented. As soon as you start getting past middle management, you get into the executives and the board level. We start to see an incredible drop-off of women in the workplace. So, for example, at middle management, we're looking at about 45% women. At executive level, we're looking at 10% women. And by the time you look at CEOs generally, we're looking at 17.1%. And if we look at CEOs in our ASX 200, so our, I'd say roughly translates to the 200 largest companies in Australia, we're only looking at 2 to 3% of the CEOs being female. So we do have an incredible problem with getting not women into the workforce, but getting them to progress through the workforce to the highest sort of levels of the workforce, if that makes sense.
Oh, and
Yeah.
any like difference salary because the genders
Yeah.
apa?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely. We have on average, we have a 14% gap. We call it the gender wage gap. And the wage gap has sat between it's been about 15%, but between 14 and 19% for the last 20 years. And we are seeing some inroads there, but as I said, 20 years of 15% means that we're not really moving it that much. There are two industries I know of where that's much higher is normally cited, and this is quite usual I think across the board in a lot of countries, is in the financial sector. That wage gap goes up to about 30% difference between men and women. The other sector that goes up to 30% is the arts sector. So creative arts, and that's across the field of arts. So like without breaking that down further, I know that in particular female authors are paid 30% less on average, and a few other areas. And so that's quite interesting because the financial sector we tend to associate with a male-dominated field, whereas the arts sector sort of tends to come with more feminine ideas. And it's quite interesting that we see also an incredible wage gap there that hasn't been accounted for.
And what's your opinion? Why any gaps about the the men and women?
Yeah.
What's your opinion? Cultural or maybe still patriarchal?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
cultural being the patriarchal
Ah,
culture.
okay.
So there've been plenty of studies into it. There is absolutely no reason to suggest that a wage gap should still exist. Even when they try and balance it out for changes in education or workforce participation or general work history, they cannot account for a 30% gap. I'm guessing here, I know there's a small gap that they can account for on those bases, but not anywhere near the 30% gap that you're looking at in those top gaps, but also the 14% gap, there's only a couple of percent that they're able to account for. So what the rest tells us is that there's a gap of unknown unpaid wages, which usually has been hypothesized that usually comes down to men being perceived by a patriarchal society to be more competent at their job regardless of whether they are. So for example, women are coming out at, I think, 60% of graduates of university tertiary level education are women. So what that says is women in the workforce are more educated, but that's not translating to higher wages. So the other thing that can account for that is obviously that women aren't getting to those top echelons, those highest paid positions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether perhaps the reason why women aren't reaching that top tier of employment is due to the fact that they are leaving the workforce to have children. And perhaps our government does not provide childcare for these women, or aid or support from their partners. And that's why these women are having to leave the workforce and enter again after a break. And does this impact their earning capacity?
Yes. So, interesting question, Sandra. So, the number one thing that comes up, it's quite interesting. In Australia, there's a culture of not really wanting to talk about this. I'd say in general discussion, I think because people have felt that we've made so many inroads into getting women participating in the workforce. We're now at about almost 50% of the workforce being female. There's an idea of there being no barriers to women's entry into the workforce. And that culture is starting to sort of permeate so that people are saying things like, we don't need feminism anymore. Look at all of the women in the workplace. There's no issues. But actually what you'll see is often what happens, and they've sort of suggested that what happens when you get to middle management is you start to see a drop-off of women because they start to have children. And so what happens is that in Australian culture, we've shifted our culture so that we've allowed women into the workforce, but we haven't shifted our culture to allow men out of the workforce. So women are often taking time off from work to have children. They anyone can take 12 months of leave, and their work has to keep a job for them when they return. But women get 3 months of paid leave by the government, and often the private sector will negotiate much higher pay than that during that time, or longer leave. Men only get 2 weeks of paid leave, and after, if they want to take leave, it's unpaid. So what that's telling us is that there's a culture of women being allowed to take 3 months off because they've had a child, or men only being allowed to take 2 weeks off because they've had a child. And the shift hasn't been to allow for men to take a more dominant role in family and child rearing. So what often happens is that you'll have men say things like, but women are just better at it. They're more biologically, attuned to being better at child raising. But actually, other than breastfeeding, women don't have any skills in child raising that men also don't have. So if you talk to people, I think many women here would say that when they had their first child, they didn't know what they were doing. They weren't sure how to look after the child and when it should eat and how to swaddle a baby. Those aren't natural
How to keep it alive.
things. Yeah, how to keep the child alive. It's not a natural skill. It's something that you learn. But if you're giving women 3 months off to get to know their child, to understand, to learn these skills, and you're only giving men 2 weeks, you can see that women are getting better at that. Women continue to build those skills. They get better at that. Men go back to the workforce. And in Australia, so men get better at their career while women get better at child rearing. So then what happens is a discussion often happens between partners where they say, oh, well, someone still needs to be at home with the kids, or we need to pay for someone. And in Australia, paying for someone is incredibly expensive. Childcare is... a lot of people cite that women don't go back to work because childcare is too expensive. It's too expensive for them to go back to work. And so they stay out of the workforce because their husband, while they've been out of the workforce for 3 months or a year, their husband's been continuing to progress his career. And interestingly, we see that after a couple has had a child, the woman will usually severely drop her hours at work. So usually she'll take time off, she might go back part-time, and that's the most common scenario, is that she either never goes back to work or she goes back part-time. Men, we see an average 4-hour-a-week increase in work. So men who have kids are not only going back to work sooner, but they're working more hours, even though they've got a brand new child at home that they have the opportunity to be bonding with, to be helping with the raising and the learning of those skills, like how to raise a child. So what we see is that the culture isn't there yet in Australia, and there's a lot of frustration because I think people are only ever looking at it from the female side. They're only ever saying, but women are in the workforce and why they're just not getting to the top because they want to have kids, and then they want to take time off work. But actually what's happening is that men just aren't in a position to culturally, they don't take time off. We still have things like men will refer to being a mum dad when what they mean is a stay-at-home dad, or like men who ask for flexible working hours. It's significantly less men in Australia will ask for flexible working hours than women, and the men who do, half of them are declined. And so the culture in Australia is not to allow men to go back to work and men to spend more time at home with their families. So we see that like a lot of men are really hindered by that.
Because
a lot of men like this, yeah. A lot of men are severely hindered by that, and they eventually their boss will make it too hard, or their workplace will make it too hard, or their friends will make enough comments about it being, he's doing his wife's job, or you're just babysitting, are you the mum now? And eventually a man will go, this is too hard. It's too hard for me to be at home. Society is telling me I shouldn't be there, so I won't go. I'll stay at work and my wife will stay at home with the kids. And so we have a culture of bringing women into the workforce, and then when they have to drop out because of family reasons, no one's saying, oh, but why isn't your husband instead taking taking the cut in his work life. So we have a big problem in Australia because of that.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, but because in Indonesia I have like gender mainstreaming.
Yeah.
It is how in Australia gender mainstreaming program or government do to gender mainstreaming program.
So gender mainstreaming would be kind of what we spoke about the other day, where they create more opportunities for women in the workforce. So for instance, in feminist organizations in Australia, there is a legislation that allows these organizations to hire only women in the organizations. And similarly, organizations, there has to be... There has to be specific percentages of employees equally represented on equal strata. And I think that there are roles as well where it would be someone's role within the organization to make sure that there is representation for women and men. But of course, then there has also been a lot of backlash by men. It seems like, why are all these jobs being created for women, or why are certain organizations only able to hire women, as though they're afraid that they're going to miss out on their slice of the pie. So, there's just this joke that, employment and wages is not a pie. Yeah, I think there's that debate, right? Yeah.
Yeah, udah?
No.
Okay. Okay. Any question about? I have a question. Bagaimana perlindungan untuk saksi korban KDRT dari Nabila di Gamping? Ya, ini related with the domestic violence. It's okay. About perlindungan saksi perlindungan saksi korban. Perlindungan saksi korban. Pertanyaan tadi? Bagaimana perlindungan untuk saksi korban KDRT? Oh ya. Jadi I'm sorry, but I don't understand that. Untuk ini, if any neighbors they watch any case about the domestic violence and how to give the witness ya, saksi itu untuk safe, because sometimes the perpetrator give the mengancam like that. Jadi,
are you talking about protection orders?
Ya, perlindungan saksi karena saksi.
So it's protection orders. Okay, yeah. And what about it?
Bagaimana kalau mungkin di Australia itu ada nggak semacam perlindungan saksi korban? Kalau di sini kan di Indonesia itu ada semacam lembaga LPSK, semacam lembaga perlindungan saksi.
Oh, apparently they have like a witness protection, specific witness protection. I'm actually not too sure on that. I do know that in Australia, like our domestic violence laws, the moment that a woman can call up and make a report, and what is that term for it? You can take a restraining order against your partner if you feel that your life is threatened. So this restraining order can come into effect, and the partner can't come within a certain distance of you, and that includes the children as well. So that's actually like a lot of the men who attend the program that I used to facilitate, they would have had a restraining order put on them, and so they're attending the program that is mandated by the court, so that they can reverse the restraining order, so that they can get access to their children again.
Sometimes use telepon itu namanya, hotline ya. Any something like hotline.
Yeah, we do actually have. We've got I'm trying to think of the names of it because I haven't lived in Australia for about a year and a half now. But we've got the Wire, so women can call. It's like a domestic. It's actually a gendered violence hotline. So women can call and say that something is happening right now. What do I do? Or maybe even if I think that we have acute services
Huh?
and non-acute. So I actually used to be a volunteer for Lifeline. So we would get people who call in who were currently maybe felt that their life was under threat. So we were trained as a phone counselor to actually try to keep them safe until services could come and make sure that they were okay. So that we do have those, but as well, women can call up and get advice. We've got community health centers where people who work in these community centers, even though they might be just working in front desk, when they call up, we do get calls in community centers of people saying like, oh, okay, well, I think that my husband has been drinking. I'm really afraid for my life and my children. What do I do? So we have either the person who works in the community center might give them options that they can of how they can keep themselves safe, but also direct them to an NGO or an organization that specializes in domestic violence and can put them in a shelter or a refuge until the situation is okay. Because one of the things that is the biggest predictor of death for women with domestic violence is the partner finding out that they've made a report and that the woman is trying to leave. It is this in this time frame where their life is actually most at risk. So actually in Australia, we do have a lot of services that make sure that they are safe in that period of time and can take them all the way to a safe point. Yeah.
Okay, you want or I will ask you next question. Okay, I will ask you about what is okay. What is main problem of women when they decide to work? Sometimes it is happening. For example, Indonesia, if women decide to work, they will face some problem with the husband, something with the neighbor, something with the family, sometimes many things. And what's your opinion in Australia?
Australian women don't really face, I'm going to say that tentatively, I am not familiar with any problems that women face entering the workforce. There is an expectation that women earn their own money. So within, I'd sort of say, the general, like if I'm talking about sort of your white Australian population, we would expect that women are working and that they're earning their own money. I can't speak for other cultures. There's obviously, we're a multicultural society, so we have a lot of people from other cultures who live in Australia, and they would obviously they might experience other hindrances to going into the workforce. But in sort of the general sort of majority, you would say that women don't really experience any issues. Actually, one of the major issues that people will experience, particularly I've heard, I only know about in professional sort of like, you know, after you've done tertiary education, there's a lot of, and I presume it extends throughout the workforce, there's a lot of problems with employers wanting to ascertain whether or not women are about to have children. So again, this comes back to the idea, the problem we have of men not coming out of the workforce and women exiting the workforce when they have children. So I had a friend who interviewed for a job as an architect. So she's done an undergraduate and a master's. She's come out as an architect. She did incredibly well. She was in sort of the top part of her class, and throughout the interview was asked about her relationship status and whether or not, it was serious, and sort of trying to figure out whether or not she would be having children soon. They even asked her opinion on another colleague who she'd done university with who was male and whether or not he would be a good candidate. I'll note that those things aren't legal. You can't do that in Australia. You're not, or had she, and she didn't get the job, had she have not gotten the job and chosen to take action, she would have had a good legal case to say that what they were doing is completely inappropriate. But those things still happen. Those things exist in Australia. People are often, I was talking to a lecturer of mine, I study law. We think of law as like a reasonably progressive area for women. A lot of the big firms are doing a lot for women in the workforce, trying to make it more easier and more flexible for them to stay in the workforce. And I had a lecturer say to me, don't, if you go to a job interview, tell them that you don't want kids. Tell them that you're not going to be having kids because you don't want them thinking you're going to take time off for maternity leave. They're probably not going to hire you. So in Australia, the hindrance to going into the workforce is still the idea that women are going to have children, then they're going to take maternity leave, and then they're going to stay at home, they're never going to come back, and what's the point in hiring them? And we have to pay them while they're on maternity leave. So that's starting to change. Like I said, it's no longer legal. You can't legally deny someone a job because of that. But people still think that. It's still a problem. It's still something that exists in Australia. It's a cultural issue.
Related with my last question, it means any double burden faced in Australian women in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the housework divide, so women on average do just over 5 hours of housework a day. I think that housework and childcare, that range of things. Men, their male partner will only do 3. So we're sort of looking at a 20% gap there where women are doing more work. And actually, it goes to the cultural issue again. So women who are earning more than their husbands, so women who become the traditional breadwinner of the family, actually sort of their housework hours go up. They increase. And the hypothesis behind that is that women are doing it because their husbands feel emasculated. They feel like they should be the breadwinner, like they should be the one earning the most money, like they shouldn't have to take on the female tasks of housework. And then because they start earning more money than them, they take on the guilt of earning more money than their husbands. And so all of a sudden they start to increase the amount of, and that's regardless of whether or not their husband is, it doesn't matter whether or not their husband's working full-time or at home full-time. So even if their husband is at home full-time and so feasibly has more time to do housework and childbearing tasks, the woman will still do more housework than the man, even though she's working full-time hours and often very long full-time hours when she's working in those higher levels. So we see that double burden of housework and employment, and actually more so if you earn more, which is interesting.
Okay.
I'll just add to that as well. I think that as well, a lot of these pressures are internalized by the women in our society. So like a woman who is very successful and probably spends a lot of time away from the home and away from her children, possibly, and I don't think that this is conjecture. I actually think it's true that women feel guilty, so they feel they have to do more. And there is this pressure on women nowadays to perform. You have to be a good mother. You have to be a good wife. You have to take care of the home. But you also have to be successful. You also have to be educated. You also have to be skinny. You also have to... There is a lot, I think, an expectation that is put. And I've noticed that, we're not... no one is exempt from these sorts of pressures, but I feel like almost like the more progressive we get in our society, the more that we get for ourselves, the more pressure we put on ourselves even. And we cannot distinguish that role like... women want to do it all, and I guess it's sad that we feel guilty when we do get what we want.
I'll just add to that the guilt isn't just, like you said, it's not just internal. There is a generally acknowledged culture of sort of society thinking that someone's being a bad mum when they're working. So in particular, the really popular example is in politics. So if a woman is in politics and doesn't have children, then there's a lot of discussion about her being maybe a bit cold or a bit harsh or a bit heartless, and how can you as a woman not want to have children? Those sorts of questions get asked. Men in politics don't get asked any of those questions. Men who have children in politics, it's completely reasonable that they spend a long period of time away from home, working when Parliament is sitting in Canberra, so in a different city often. And women who have children will have comments like, oh, who's looking after the children? Are your kids okay without you? And they'll say, of course, they're with my husband, their father, who can look after them. But or I've left them under the care of my parents, or wherever they've been left, they're being cared for. But the difference is that women are constantly in the workforce fielding questions about why they're not at home with their children, and then people are saying, well, why is it that more women aren't in the workforce when they have children?
Okay.
And also the alternate to that is people asking, why haven't you have children yet when you're working?
Okay. Last statement, Sandra and Lauren. Maybe apa? Last statement. No last statement. Okay. You?
No, I think I've said everything I needed to say.
Okay. No last statement, but many explanation that we can learn about that. It is many explanation. If you still confused, you can still watching in FB because it is still will Instagram, Facebook, ya, YouTube, ya YouTube juga. Oke, saya kira sudah ini waktunya udah selesai atau masih ada lagi? Gimana? Sebentar. Oke. Sapa Ari Azhar yang sudah bertanya tapi waktu tidak cukup. Apa? Sapi. Sebentar. Sapa Ari Azhar yang Oke. It is enough ya. Ada last statement sudah tidak ada explanation. Kita tutup Sinau Sareng kali ini. Kita akan ketemu di kesempatan yang lain dengan topik yang lain dan tentunya tetap menarik. Dan ini terakhir, mereka nanti minggu ini akan pulang ke Australia. Bye dulu. Oke, terima kasih teman-teman, terima kasih teman-teman Mitra Wacana semua, teman-teman netizen yang telah terlibat. Selamat sore.